Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. It was 10 years ago this week that the first detainees were transferred to the United States Detention Center at Guantanamo Bay. A decade on, and 171 detainees remain in the Caribbean jailhouse in what is widely criticized as a flagrant human rights violation. Activists refer to torture, enforced disappearances, and illegal detention. Those inside have either never been charged or face unfair trial by military commission. Advocates say Guantanamo Bay is a necessary evil, part of Washington's ammunition against al-Qaeda by defining those inside as enemy combatants in a war on terror. And the detention center can also be seen in part of a broader debate about whether the US lives up to the human rights principles it preaches. American leaders use lofty language about universal values and extending freedoms. But they use such terminology ahead of attacks on Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, when really they were advancing political and economic interests, say the critics. So, does the US, like all great powers, use human rights selectively to suit its own self-interest? Or is any advocacy of human rights a good thing, and America's mixed scorecard is better than nothing? To analyse these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by David Chandler from the University of Westminster, Rob Freer from the rights group Amnesty International, Anthony Dworkin from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the phone from Moscow by the political analyst Alexander Nagorny. Let's start with Rob, because Amnesty has published a report for the 10-year Guantanamo anniversary. What does it say?
Well, it talks about how Guantanamo remains a symbol of an assault on human rights that took place after the attacks of 9/11. And it remains so not just because of the abuses, some of the abuses have since stopped. Some of the torture and enforced disappearance that you mentioned earlier have stopped there. But the assault on human rights continues in the form of indefinite military detention without criminal trial, and the absence of accountability for past violations and for redress for those who have faced them. So the human rights issues remain broad, associated with Guantanamo, and the failure of President Obama's administration to fulfill his promise to close it is a serious disappointment for us.
Anthony, Guantanamo Bay, a gross rights violation or a vital plank in the war on terror?
I think that Guantanamo Bay is a violation of human rights. It represents what, in my view, is a mistaken policy by the U.S. administration. It's something that was put in place under President Bush, and President Obama, I think, despite his promises to close it, as Rob mentioned, has found it very difficult to close it. He's faced a very difficult political climate within the United States. Congress has essentially laid down a series of restrictions that have made it very difficult. And it's also probably worth pointing out that President Obama, like his predecessor, President Bush, does subscribe to the idea that the United States is at war with al-Qaeda and associated terrorist groups, and that detaining enemy fighters is part of what countries can do during war. I disagree with that analysis. I think the people who are there should be put before a criminal trial that offers due process, or they should be released. So in my view, despite the fact that President Obama has made some improvements, some of the human rights violations associated with the U.S. counterterrorism project do continue.
Alexander, what's the view from Moscow? Some of those locked up inside Guantanamo Bay are linked with plots to kill civilians indiscriminately. Aren't we all better off with those people behind bars?
Well, of course it's a gross violation, but what is the way out? That's another question. Obama, as a president, of course, he failed to fulfill his promise and to somehow better relations with human rights in terms of Guantanamo Bay. But really, in this case, he should involve probably a UN organization and suggest or put forward the initiative to create some kind of international court for such cases. And he failed to do that, so actually he followed the suit of former President Mr. Bush. That's my idea. Of course, I'm not in a position to put forward some kind of initiatives or blame only Obama or some other political figures. But still, the case is very simple. I can't see that this president of the United States or the future after the election will solve the situation, because actually it comes into conflict with the imperial stance of the United States, which it plays on the global scale. So they have to reassess their position in the world. And then, of course, the situation with Guantanamo and other, I would say, very dangerous violations would be solved, such as the situation in Libya, actions in Afghanistan, and pending war against Iran, which is very frightening to my mind.
I think we'll come to some of those issues later, but David, I want to put one issue that Alexander raises. What is the way out for America when it comes to Guantanamo Bay?
I think it's very difficult to solve these questions as questions of law. And clearly the issue of Guantanamo Bay was that it was actions outside of the Geneva Convention. So those prisoners were not held under civil law or internationally accepted military law. And I think that one of the reasons why we have actions without a framework of law is that the traditional structures of international law and, in fact, domestic law seem to be crumbling. And I think that it's very problematic to say, as Alexander does, that somehow human rights is going to solve those problems. In fact, it could be argued that a lot of our discussions about human rights, this ethical and moral understanding of the world, has done a lot to undermine frameworks of law.
Alexander, would you like to come back on that?
Actually, I agree with him that the situation is very complicated, and unfortunately, international public, especially human rights organizations, play a very small role in such very important international issues. And by the way, human rights violations, they are not confined barely to Guantanamo Bay. I would say that, the military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq actually also can be referred to very gross violations of the human rights.
Maybe I'd like to put that one over to Anthony. The point that Alexander raises, to what extent did the US invasion of Iraq damage the treatise of liberal interventionism?
Okay, well, before I come to that, I just want to take issue with the point that David made, that human rights are somehow contributing to the problem that we now face and undermining international law. Since 1945, human rights have been an integral part of international law, and I think it doesn't really make sense to talk about international law at this point without human rights being part of the picture. I think if you look at what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, you have to judge this against what are universal standards for the way that all states should treat individuals within their power. And I think that notion of a universal limits on what states can do to people under their control is a very powerful and important force that we should not let go of. I don't, for myself, see a direct connection as part of an imperial project between Afghanistan, Iraq, Guantanamo. To me, these are, perhaps linked politically in some ways. I think the action that the United States undertook in Afghanistan had very strong international support at the beginning. The United Nations Security Council clearly endorsed the idea that there was a right of self-defense, that an armed attack had taken place against the United States on 9/11. And, I think that has to be recognized before we can then go on to say some of the things that took place after that went outside the framework of international law. The war in Iraq seems to me, again, a rather different case that was done outside Security Council authorization. The notion of humanitarian intervention, which you raise, liberal internationalism, wasn't really part of the justification for Iraq at the beginning. It sort of was brought in as the war went along as the initial justification, which was really a security justification, a mistaken security justification, in my view, began to unravel. There's no doubt that over the last 20 years, we have come to see the project of liberal interventionism, the use of military force to secure human rights and to prevent humanitarian crisis. We've come to see it as a much more complicated business than people thought, and I think that's entirely right. One should never undertake military action lightly. International justification and authorization is important. Regional support is important. It's always complicated and the last resort, but I think that the fundamental case for it is not undermined by what happened in Iraq.
Rob and David both want to come back on that, but maybe Rob can go first.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember when we discuss the issue of human rights and the issue of war, that what the Bush administration did, and in setting up Guantanamo, that was one outcome of it, was that they concocted a theory of a global war without limits, under which human rights standards did not apply. And not only that, but neither did the Geneva Conventions, and instead a unilateral interpretation of the law of war is implied. And we're still living with that today, with the three branches of the US government all generally, including the Obama administration, accepting this global war paradigm. And out of that paradigm came such activities as the CIA secret detention program, in which people were subjected systematically to enforced disappearance and torture, which are crimes under international law, for which there has been no accountability whatsoever. And today, Guantanamo will not be closed, or if it is closed, the problem, the human rights problem, if you want to see it in human rights terms, will only be relocated precisely because the global war paradigm persists and the US continues not to apply a human rights framework to this. So you will see unfair trials and indefinite military detention without trial of people who should be brought before civilian courts in an ordinary fashion.
One of the main problems of this discussion is that human rights are being equated as similar to law and not as seen as entirely a different way of categorising actions and our understandings. And I think we can only really understand the impact of liberal internationalism as an erosion of international law, whether it's ethical and moral concerns over Kosovo, whether it's the same liberal internationalist claims over Iraq or over Libya. Law cannot withstand human rights claims. Human rights claims are not legal claims. They're not the same as civil, democratic and political rights. They're ethical and moral concerns. Now, sometimes quite rightly, we can argue that these concerns are important, and in the 90s many people did that. They said that these claims are so important that international law has to step back, that we cannot allow the formalities of the UN Security Council to say whether we should intervene or not, that we cannot allow the formalities of international law and laws of sovereignty to say whether we can intervene. And similarly, human rights claims would also say that democratically elected governments shouldn't be the final say, that there should be courts and judges, and beyond that an understanding of natural law, ethical or moral concerns. And I think once we begin to understand how law was seen as a barrier to doing good and to doing right, especially in the 90s after the end of the Cold War, then we can understand why we have a mess of problems from Guantanamo Bay to any other issues around civil liberties and democracy today.